The ordinary on the edge of disaster.
The Monday started lazily. I've never been fond of Mondays, but who is? I made a strong cup of black coffee, opened the kitchen window to let in the fresh autumn air. The street was already waking up. Neighbors were pulling their cars out of the driveways. Children with backpacks were heading for the school bus. Everything as usual. Everything's fine. I took a sip from my mug, watching a group of crows circling above the distant field. I had a strange habit of noticing the little things. Maybe it was because I spent most of my time alone. After my parents died, my father passed away from a heart attack 2 years ago, and my mother didn't survive the depression after he left. I lived alone. It suited me. The bookshelves by the wall were filled with books. 2 rows of Stephen King, a couple of Faulkner novels, several technical survival guides. In the past few years, I had become obsessed with the post-apocalyptic theme. I read everything I could find, from tactical manuals to theories on how to rebuild civilization from scratch. The basement of my house was a pretty good start for a small bunker. Not that I was sure it would ever come in handy, but hey, what if it does? On the shelves there were cans, packages of rice, pasta, gallons of drinking water. Next to them, an old Geiger counter, a couple of first aid kits, several packages of potassium iodide. A Mossberg shotgun stood in the corner of the basement, always reliable, even though it was a bit old. The Glock was in the drawer next to my bed.
A day of routine.
After breakfast, I loaded the dishes into the dishwasher and turned on the TV. The news, politics, economy, some conflicts between countries. They were discussing again how China and Russia are getting closer while the US is losing ground. I yawned and switched to a channel showing a documentary about floods. The world seemed so vast and yet so fragile. By noon, I was ready to head into town. I was wearing old jeans and a leather jacket. In one pocket, I had my car keys, and in the other, a small folding knife. Not because I was afraid of anything, just a habit. My Jeep Compass was parked in the driveway. It wasn't a new car, but it was reliable. The engine started with a soft hum, and I pulled out onto the road. The drive to town took about 20 minutes. I turned on the radio, where the host was talking about geopolitical tension and possible economic consequences. I switched it to music. What did I care about that? The gym was quiet. It was a weekday morning, not many people around. I ran a couple of kilometers on the treadmill, then worked with dumbbells. My old acquaintance John showed up midway through my workout. We exchanged a few words. He told me about plans to take his family to the mountains. I wished him good luck.
Supermarket and oddities.
I arrived at the supermarket around 1 p.m. The parking lot was almost full, which was strange for a weekday. People were crowding near the entrance, some shouting angrily. I walked inside, grabbed a basket, and started wandering between the aisles. Something was clearly missing from the shelves. Canned goods, grains, water, everything was being snatched up quickly. The lines at the checkout were longer than usual. I put my basket down and looked around. "What's going on?" I asked the cashier when it was my turn.
Hell if I know, I said no, just rumors.
Rumors. They always spread panic. I just smiled.
A restless evening.
I came back home in the evening. Everything seemed normal, but you know that feeling when something's not right? I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Thoughts kept spinning in my head. Rumors, strange behavior from people. I woke up in the middle of the night to a low hum. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was the sound of engines. Airplanes, military transports. Lights were blinking in the sky, forming a chain. The next day I wondered, had we come too close to the edge?
Preparation, without warning.
The next morning, everything was in its place, as though the planes the night before had been just a dream. I made a rule for myself. If unease lingers into the morning, it's worth checking out. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through a couple of Telegram channels and news sites. Nothing, just the usual chatter. News, forecasts, ads. The TV was silent about anything concerning. Routine. But I couldn't stop thinking about the people from the supermarket. What if they knew something I didn't? I went outside. It was cold. Autumn was taking over. Leaves had nearly covered my driveway. I grabbed an old broom from the garage and began sweeping them up, lost in thought, thinking the worst isn't paranoia. It's logic. Yet no warnings had come, and I kept wondering, could it all just be a coincidence? After noon, I decided to drive to the gun store. It was more for my own peace of mind than anything else. I knew the owner, Dave. We'd crossed paths at the shooting range a few times, and he always liked to talk about life.
Hey,
He greeted me when I walked in.
it's busy today.
He was right. The store was full of people. Some were discussing calibers, others asking about bulletproof vests. I grabbed a couple of boxes of ammo for my Glock and headed to the counter. Anything interesting? I asked Dave while he rang up my purchase. He shook his head.
Just what's on the news?
We both laughed, but it was a forced laugh.
Notes on danger.
Back at home, I put away the groceries in the fridge and, as I like to say, saved for later the rest of my purchases in the basement. Then I sat at the table with a piece of paper. There was something calming about making lists. I wrote down everything I had, 3 months' worth of food, water, around 50 gallons, personal medical kit plus first aid kits, a pump-action shotgun, a pistol, and around 500 rounds for them, several gas canisters for the stove, all sorts of tools, an axe, shovel, rope, knives, and 5 gas cans I'd kept since the pandemic. It all looked normal, maybe even excessive. But you know, it's like a fire exit. Better to have it and not need it than the other way around.
Conversation with the neighbor.
In the evening, just as it was getting dark, I heard someone knocking at the door. It was my neighbor, Jack. He was about 45 and lived across the street. His family was typical for the area, wife, 2 kids, and a dog.
Hey,
He said, nodding.
did your lights go out?
I was surprised. No, everything was working fine here,
That's weird.
Jack muttered.
Our whole street lost power, and the phones are down too.
That was unusual. Our neighborhood rarely had infrastructure problems. You can come in, I offered. We headed to the kitchen. Jack looked worried. He told me that his wife had tried to call her parents in another state in the morning, but the line was busy. The internet was also starting to act up. We exchanged some guesses, but it didn't clear things up. When Jack left, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease.
A sleepless night.
The next day, the tension only grew. The news sounded more and more anxious, as if even the announcers didn't understand what was happening. They talked about communication failures, breakdowns in some management systems, but it was all presented in a routine manner. I spent the day doing chores, pruning trees in the yard, checking the car battery, cleaning my weapons. Everything as usual. But thoughts of what might happen kept circling in my mind. In the evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. I could hear Jack's dog barking across the street. Everything seemed so normal, like nothing could go wrong. But that was the last normal evening.
The last dawn.
On the 3rd day, it started. The radio broadcast strange alarm signals from the moment I woke up. The announcers' voices became more tense. I was at home when the first alerts began. My phone vibrated with messages from the emergency notification service. The screen flashed in big letters.
Attention, seek shelter immediately. Possible nuclear attack threat. Stay tuned. Follow the news.
I froze, staring at the screen. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else.
The first 30 minutes. Between panic and action.
When the message came through, my mind was in chaos. Thoughts were racing, overwhelmed with adrenaline. Part of me tried to calm down. It's just a warning, nothing serious. Another part, the more rational one, whispered, "No time for doubts. Do what you need to do." I ran to the basement. The stairs creaked under my feet as I opened the door. My supplies were ready, but I needed a plan. In moments like this, the ability to focus becomes a matter of life and death. I quickly checked the backpack I had packed a couple of months ago. Sleeping bag, first aid kit, spare clothes, canned goods, water bottles, flashlight. Everything was in place. I then went back upstairs to the window. Outside, everything looked calm, but there was something wrong in the silence. Even the birds were silent. The TV buzzed with a worrying voice.
Citizens, stay in shelters. I repeat, seek shelter immediately.
I glanced at my watch. If something really was about to happen, I had no more than half an hour.
Driving to the city, instinct takes over.
10 minutes later, I was behind the wheel of the Jeep. I don't know why I went to the city. Maybe just the habit of checking the situation, seeing it with my own eyes. Such situations had seemed unreal before, like something out of a movie. But now, panic had set in on the roads. Cars moved erratically. Some just stopped, drivers shouting something from their windows. I heard someone honking non-stop. When I reached the supermarket, I realized the city was already on the brink of chaos. People were lined up, grabbing anything they could. Carts were piled high with water, canned goods, even candles. I walked inside and immediately felt the pressure. Not physical, moral. The people around were like a pack of animals, ready to fight for a piece of meat. I grabbed a couple of boxes of canned goods, some water bottles, and a pack of batteries. The rest I already had.
This is Kais. Serum is the last one.
I heard the cashier's voice as I approached the counter. His hands were shaking and he didn't lift his head. As I was leaving, I bumped into Jack. He was hauling a large bag, his eyes darting around. "You heard?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied shortly. We both knew this wasn't a coincidence.
The first, flash.
When I stepped outside, the sky split open with a blinding light. It filled with a white, so bright it hurt, and I instinctively dropped to the curb, covering my head with my hands. My heart stopped. Then came the sound, a massive, all-encompassing roar, like the earth itself was screaming. The air vibrated, as if it were about to tear apart. I ran to the car. Everything around me turned chaotic. People screamed, cars crashed into each other, some were running aimlessly. My first thought was, home. I pulled out of the parking lot, trying not to think that this might be the last time I'd see this city. In the rearview mirror, I saw the black mushroom cloud slowly rising into the sky. It was far, maybe 20 kilometers away, but even from that distance, its size was terrifying.
The way, home.
Chaos erupted on the roads. People abandoned their cars and fled in panic. I tried to drive confidently, but my hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I broke every rule. I drove on sidewalks, through green zones, ran over, and even bumped into cars that blocked my way. Fortunately, my car's clearance and engine power were enough. I sped as fast as I could. A man punched the hood of my car, shouting something unintelligible, but I just drove past him. I don't know how much time passed before I reached my house. Maybe half an hour, maybe an hour. Everything blurred into one endless stream of sounds, shouting, engine noise, and chaos. I think if I had been driving any small sedan, I wouldn't have made it out of the city, engulfed in panic. The house was still there, but now it felt unfamiliar. I grabbed everything I had bought and descended to the basement, first closing all the windows in the house.
The first day in the new world.
The silence was deafening. No cars, no voices, no birds, just me and my thoughts. The TV no longer worked. The radio only picked up strange, broken signals. The power went out closer to evening. I grabbed a flashlight and lit a candle, trying to figure out what to do next. The night felt endless. I sat in the basement, holding a gun on my lap. Every rustle outside made me tense up. By morning, the silence was still there, but now it was heavier.
The first steps to survival.
I knew one thing. The first days after nuclear strikes are the most dangerous. The radioactive dust kicked up by the explosions settles on the ground, contaminating everything around it. Radioactive fallout could also come with rain. The scientific articles I had read and the videos I had watched on YouTube warned. If you want to survive, stay indoors for at least a week. I sealed the ventilation holes throughout the house and in the basement and carefully checked that they were protected by filters I had prepared earlier. A heavy blanket hung over the basement door to prevent dust from seeping through the cracks. It was just me, my supplies, and the silence.
The first hours, unbearable waiting.
Sitting in the basement, knowing that hell was unfolding outside, was torture. The TV was dead. The radio only caught occasional fragments of words or static. At one point, I heard something that sounded like a warning.
The eastern part of the state. Stay indoors. Radioactive fallout is reaching.
But the signal cut off. This only strengthened my resolve to stay inside. I sat at the table, listening to the ticking of an old wristwatch, recording every hour in my notebook. How much time had passed? A couple of hours or an entire day? My sense of time had vanished.
Day 1, alarm.
The first day was the hardest. Every sound outside seemed threatening. Sometimes I heard distant muffled thuds like explosions or gunshots, but I knew that going outside was a death sentence. I ate straight from a can, barely tasting the food. I had no appetite, just instinct. Eat to stay alive. At night, I sat in total darkness. I turned on the flashlight for only a couple of minutes at a time. Batteries were in short supply. Sleep came later, shallow and filled with uneasy dreams.
Day 3, echoes of the world.
On the third day, I heard a voice outside for the first time. It was a man's voice, shouting from somewhere in the street.
Is anyone there? Hey, anyone alive?
The voice sounded persistent, yet desperate. I pressed myself against the staircase, gripping my rifle tightly, but I didn't respond. The man outside kept shouting for a couple more minutes before his voice faded away. I began to wonder, was I doing the right thing? Maybe that person really needed help. But then I remembered what the survival guides said. Trust no one.
Day 4, loneliness.
The fourth day was filled with silence. No voices, no footsteps, just the creaks of the house above me. I kept myself busy to avoid losing my mind. I counted my supplies, checked my weapon, and wrote my thoughts in a notebook. What surprised me was how quickly loneliness became normal. The voice in my head became my only companion.
Day 7, preparing to go out.
On the seventh day, I decided it was time to go outside. Based on my calculations, the fallout should have settled by now, and radiation levels should have dropped. I checked my gear, a respirator and protective goggles, gloves, sturdy boots, and a thick jacket. I didn't plan to stay outside for more than a few minutes. My main goal was to scout the area and figure out what was happening around me.
The first step into a new world.
When I opened the basement door, fresh air hit my face. It was cold and carried a strange metallic taste. Outside, the world looked like a photograph of the apocalypse. The leaves on the trees had turned black, and the ground was covered in gray dust. My house was still standing, but the windows were caked with grime, as if coated in ash. I slowly walked to the end of my street. There was no one, just abandoned walls, some with their doors left wide open, as if their owners had fled in panic. On the horizon, thin columns of smoke rose into the sky.
The neighborhood of the dead.
I approached Jack's house. His door was ajar. I knocked, but there was no response. Inside, everything looked as though the family had left in a hurry. Dirty plates were still on the table, and the TV was frozen on a screen displaying an emergency broadcast alert. For a moment, I felt sorry for his kids. Were they still alive? Could any of us survive in this new world?
Returning and making plan.
I returned home and carefully checked myself for radioactive dust. I undressed before going back into the basement, bundling the clothes into a sealed bag. I wrote down everything I had seen. The world had changed. It had become alien, lifeless, hostile. I knew I would need to adapt if I wanted to survive. Now I needed to find a working radio to learn if there were any other survivors, food and water. My supplies would run out sooner than I expected. A secure shelter in case my neighborhood became unsafe.